Just to kind of point out a few of the esteemed dignitaries we have with us this evening. First of all, I'd like to highlight Councilwoman Blanchard. Where are you? Hello, thank you for coming. Councilman Belisario, right here. Thank you very much. State Senator Hewitt. Oh, hello. And then we have a few folks, my colleagues with the state at the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, Brent Haas and Mark Ledden. Where did you go? Mark, over in the corner. So we've got a lot of good folks in the room tonight, obviously all of you. I think we're going to have a really productive conversation tonight and start talking about what the future of the parish may look like. To help me out, I'll point out a few of my colleagues. If you're trying to catch me and I'm engrossed in another conversation, please find my colleague Dakota Fisher or Candace Watkins, both from my office. Candace used to be the mayor of Covington, so we all have ties here. Also, the state, for the purposes of this project, has formed a partnership with the Foundations of Louisiana and Ms. Liz Williams. And if you enjoyed any of the food this evening, Rachel Thomason put in a lot of work to kind of set up our logistics tonight. And then finally, this is a big project. So we're simultaneously rolling this out in 6 parishes. And so we've brought on some contract help. And here in this parish, we've asked GCR to take a lead role. Seth, where are you? So Seth and Liz will help me out with part of this presentation this evening. So the way that I typically talk about the beginning of this conversation is to say, the Office of Community Development manages a $16 billion long-term recovery portfolio. And that stems from Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Isaac, the March flooding event of last year, the August flooding event of last year. And that's all to say that when I started working for the state several years ago, we had a mantra at OCD that we were in business to get out of business. Right? So we had programs. The intent was to do everything we could, let the money run out, help as many people as possible, and then we'd all go off and do something else. Nobody talks about that anymore. And the unfortunate reality is we understand that these types of severe, repetitive disaster events are likely to continue over time. And so all of those events that I just named happened in basically an 11-year period. If you think about the next 11 years and the 11 years following that, there's no real anticipation that we're going to experience fewer events of less severity, right? We also understand that those disaster events form this very toxic brew, if you will, with our coastal condition. And so as we've lost land, as we've experienced subsidence, as we've experienced sea level rise, we know those conditions are all exacerbated by these repetitive disaster events. And we also know that as those conditions take place, we become more vulnerable to those very severe storms and flooding events that just about everybody has experienced, right? So again, that 11-year period of time, all those storms that I talked about, every parish in the state of Louisiana has been under a major disaster declaration just in that period. So if we understand that these long-term recovery activities and our coastal challenge are all intertwined as part of this big problem as a state, then we've got to get a little more creative in how we're thinking about that problem and how we're thinking about the future that we think we're going to see. So there are a couple of themes that we'll touch on repetitively throughout this presentation tonight, and one is the concept of a 3-legged stool. And so, if we understand coastal restoration, we understand structural flood protection, the third leg of that stool has to be adaptation. And we'll go into a little detail in a few minutes as to why. But the simple reality is, and we'll touch upon this several times throughout this evening as well, no matter what we do on the restoration side, and no matter what we do from the structural protection side, we know 2 things to be true. One, we're going to lose more land than we can rebuild over a period of time. Right? We can't rebuild it faster than we're losing it. Consequently, many of our low-lying communities are going to experience a heightened risk of flooding events over time. Now, here in St. Tammany Parish, we'll talk about some of those impacts as we anticipate they play out over time. But we also understand that things are changing more generally in the state of Louisiana as a result of those conditions. People are moving. Here in St. Tammany, we saw this after Katrina, right? All those people from St. Bernard moved over, changed the nature of the parish. It did. So we have to prepare those communities that are prepared to receive population, as well as those communities that are going to shrink in size as we can project our environment changing. So, first of all, I mentioned the people around the room that are helping us tonight and a lot of the expertise that we have here. But first of all, just thank you all for coming. This is a really impressive showing. It's really awesome to see so many people that are interested in this type of conversation and are interested in having a robust conversation about what the parish is going to be moving forward. There are a couple of things you can expect from us tonight. The first is we're going to have a sober conversation about how we think the environment is going to change into the future. However, if we understand how the environment is going to change into the future, and we understand that there's a downside to that, we also have to talk about the opportunities. Right? If you know something is coming, you have an opportunity to create different outcomes. And so if we talk about things along a 50-year period of time, we're basically talking about 2 generations. So if we understand today what we think is going to happen over that time period, we have a unique opportunity to start a conversation today, begin to brainstorm, use all the creativity here in the room to really vision out where we go from here. Over the next year, so, well, it's not really a year at this point, so by the end of calendar year 2017, if we're lucky and if we all work together and we all build this relationship that we're starting tonight, the idea is to have 6 adaptation strategies in hand, 1 for each parish, that really take into account the future risks that we face and some collective vision for where we're going to go in light of those risks. But to start the conversation, let's talk about adaptation. Right? So, what is the third leg of this stool? I think if I were to poll everyone in the room, what is adaptation? I would assume that we would get as many different answers as there are people in the room. There are a few definitions that we've highlighted here. So a change, reacting to a change in the environment, changing to fit some purpose or situation. The reality is adaptation has to mean what you want it to mean here in St. Tammany Parish. For the purposes of the project, though, we've talked about it in terms of building community resilience, economic prosperity, and a better quality of life for everyone in Louisiana. And so a lot of what we're saying here is around the idea that this is not just a coastal problem for Louisiana. This represents an existential threat to the viability of the state. And if we understand it in those terms, and we understand that every parish has been impacted by a major disaster event over an 11-year period of time, and we understand that populations are moving, the demographics are changing as a result of those disaster events and all of those environmental changes that are taking place, then it really is a statewide problem. And so whether you're in South Lafourche Parish or in Bush, you are somehow impacted by all the events that are taking place and the environmental changes that are happening. This project was born from something called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And so there were 67 states and municipalities that were invited to compete for $1 billion that the Department of Housing and Urban Development put up for the specific purpose of, the question was very simple. How do you understand your future disaster risk? And how are you adapting to react to it? The state ultimately finished 5th in that competition. We were awarded $93 million for 2 projects. The first project is the resettlement of a community called Ile-de-Jean-Charles in remote southeastern Tammany Parish. The intent behind that project is to understand that there are communities that are in areas that are physically no longer going to exist over a period of time. And in the case of that island, it is expected to disappear in the next 50 years or upon next significant tropical impact. So we understand that we need a model in Louisiana to understand what it means to pick up an entire community, move it somewhere safer, and give it a chance to grow and thrive. The second project that HUD gave an award to is what we're talking about here tonight. And we wrapped our response to this competition and this challenge around the idea that we're going to see three things in Louisiana. One, we know we have low-lying communities that are going to contract, right? And so as flood risk goes up, as we lose land, there are going to be communities that either shrink or, in the unfortunate scenario, may disappear entirely. The second thing that we said is, if we understand that we're going to have some heightened degree of flood risk, we also understand that the coast is a lot of our cultural and economic makeup here in the state of Louisiana. And so we have a working coast, you can't just walk away from it. But we do have to be strategic in understanding how it's going to change, how some of our communities may contract over time, what the assets are we need to protect. Finally, the third condition that we talked about, and that's one that I think is prevalent here in St. Tammany Parish, is where we can find areas that are going to be high and dry for a period of time, how do we incentivize economic growth? How do we incentivize population growth? How do we start building out infrastructure today to ensure that we can absorb population and we can grow economically? So, and that's all wrapped around the idea that if people are going to move from our most dangerous areas, they need a place to move to. So we're piloting this out in a 6-parish area: St. Tammany, Jefferson, Plaquemine, Terrebonne, Lafourche, and St. John the Baptist. And one of our challenges is to understand that planning is not new in Louisiana. It's certainly not new after Katrina. I think we all understand that that was a stopping point for everybody by which we said, okay, we've got a real problem here, and we need to start understanding how we react to it and how we build out our communities in response to some of these challenges that we face. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the expertise we've brought to the table on this project, but it's our challenge to take everything that's been done locally up to this point, combine it with everything that's in the Coastal Master Plan, all of the great data and modeling work that the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority have done, and find that piece where we can add a value addition, right? And I think it's the idea that says if we wrap our future planning efforts and our future visioning around how we see flood risk increasing or how we're projecting population growth, in an ideal world, and we're hoping to experience an ideal world here through this project, we'll all be able to get together around a common sense of where we want to go. So I'm a planner by trade, and so I'll bore you for just a moment with some planner jargon. We're going to do this through a process called co-design. But all that really means for the purposes of this conversation today is really embodied in these principles, right? So we're going to share power, prioritize relationships, include all points of view, use all kinds of knowledge. Part of what we're trying to do here is come forward with the understanding that you all know your communities, you all know your values, you all know what you care about better than we ever will. So I said I have an office in Baton Rouge, I have an office in New Orleans. I can't see St. Tammany Parish from either of those places. And even though I grew up here, I haven't lived here in a while. So that just means we have to tap into everything that you know. We can't do anything unless it's of some understanding and is adherent to the values that you all bring to the table. Finally, test solutions early and often, and I'll dive into this in just a moment. But ultimately, we want to create a feedback loop, right? And so we're going to come out, we're going to meet with you all on several occasions over the next several months. And every time we do so, we have to analyze what we've learned, we have to research based on what we've learned, and then we have to keep coming back to you and asking you a simple question. Are we right? As we've collected information from you, as we work together to develop ideas, does this reflect who you are and where you want to go, who you want to be? And we're going to ask you that repetitively over the next several months. If at any time we're doing something that doesn't reflect who you are or where you want to go, who you want to be, we need to know that too. If we're successful, we'll end up with these 6 adaptation strategies across 6 parishes, and the idea is collectively they would embody a regional strategy. So we're starting here tonight with a parish-wide meeting, and one of the things we're going to ask you this evening is, what are the linchpin communities within St. Tammany Parish? Because when we come back out and we meet again, it's not going to be in a setting in which we're in a big room and somebody like me is standing in front and delivering a presentation. It's going to be sitting down at a table having one-on-one conversations where you all live, work, play, in all those communities that you call home. And we're going to do that a couple of times. And so we'll come back later on and do a second parish-wide meeting, and then we'll go back out into smaller constituent communities. And then finally, when we come back as a parish in a larger setting for a third time, we'll have a draft plan in place, and we'll ask you for that final time, is this still right? Does this still reflect who you are and where you want to go? The state has assembled a fairly unprecedented and I think impressive collection of partners on this project, and they all offer quite a bit of expertise and knowledge. And that's great. We have to, we have to be professionals. We have to be smart. But none of this really matters without you all. So once again, I don't come to you today with a plan. I don't come to you today with projects. These are all things that we need to develop in concert with you.
Good evening. How are y'all doing? I'm Liz Williams. I'm with the Foundation for Louisiana, and I specifically manage our Coastal Resilience Leverage Fund. Now, what that means is that as we think about these environmental changes, we have to think about the way that they're also impacting our other social and economic and cultural systems. We have to think about and invest in ways for our communities to be able to respond and think about all of those many factors when we're thinking about how we'd like to adapt. Now, we need to, in order for us to think about how we adapt, we also have to think about how we got here. And we have to think about those 50 years, looking back and looking forward. How do we think about where we've been and why we need to go, why we need to think creatively about how we might adapt? So we're talking about the risks of continued land loss and the reality that we've seen our coastal ecosystems change over the last decades, and that we've seen the state respond with planning efforts and efforts to rebuild and restore our coast, provide structural protection. When we talk about that three-legged stool, we haven't begun thinking about yet, as much as we can be with you guys, what those community scale adaptations might look like that are that third leg of that stool. We have to think with you here tonight about how we'd like to respond in our communities. Now, there is the reality that with continued land loss, we're going to see increased flood risk. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. What you're looking at right now is a map of the historic river system. You're looking at the former distributaries of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River used to move here and there within an arc about 200 miles wide across the state. It's always the river's purpose to find the shortest, steepest route to the Gulf. And when it does that, every spring, when there's high water, we see fresh water and sediment deposited into our landscape. Those flooding events would deposit a new layer of soil that would build the land higher and higher upon where we would live. So what changed? What you're looking at here is the Great Flood of 1927. You're looking at a map of the Mississippi River Basin. And that river basin covers 41% of the U.S. We're draining everything from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians. And in 1927, we saw a flood event, the purple area, where those river waters extended much further. And so we had to make a decision as a country. We had to levee off the river in order to promote economic activity and development in our communities, growth where we weren't at risk to those flood events. And so we solved the problem of yearly flooding. But we also solved the problem of yearly flooding. We prevented that new layer of freshwater and sediment from building another layer of land. So now, this condition, where we saw sediment across the distributary system and across the delta landscape, turned to this, where we see all of our freshwater and sediment going out of the Bird's Foot Delta, going out through Wax Lake and the Atchafalaya Delta, and then we see starved wetlands in the middle. You see this again here in 2008, where we saw the Bonnie Carey Spillway opened, and you see that sediment go out into Lake Pontchartrain, and then you see it again going out through the Bird's Foot Delta and through the Wax Lake and Atchafalaya Deltas. Now what that means is that sediment can no longer build land, and when there's no more sediment adding to those layers, we see that land start to sink and subside. Now when that land sinks, we see that saltwater can enter and get further in. When saltwater enters, we see the plant species change and the wildlife change and eventually die off. When that happens, we see greater storm surge because the wetland buffer has always been there to protect us. And as we see that depleted, the storm surge can get further inland. There isn't that buffer to prevent the storm surge from reaching our communities. And so finally, we're at higher risk. So what we see happening is that our land is sinking at the same time as the Gulf is rising. So I'm sure you're asking, what about inside the levees? Historically, we used to build on the high ground, and we used to elevate our homes because we knew that we were in a delta landscape. We would see those river floods, and in most cases, unless they were extreme events, they would go underneath. We had prepared for it. But we've made decisions to levee off the river and prevent that new riverine flooding and the new sediment from building a new layer, and that made us more comfortable building close to the ground. We weren't at the same risk to the floods. But what that's also impacted is the amount of water that's still in the soil, and so we see the land sink. We see the land sink inside the levees more than it sinks outside the levees. There isn't that water in the soil. Those porous soils don't exist in the same way, and so we see them compact. Then that means that when the storm surge comes in and that wetland buffer has disappeared, they get further in and closer to our communities, and we're more at risk all the time. So right here, what you're looking at is an elevation map of the land that's been built by the Mississippi River. And you can see that the highest lands are the areas that are closest to the previous waterways, all of the areas where the river used to flood and drop its sediment. You can also see that some of the areas inside the levees are already below sea level. We already see that changing landscape.
So we talk about this elevation, and you can see, where the river currently runs, where it used to run, all those high ground areas. The reason why we talk about it is because it largely tracks with how we've seen populations move, specifically over the period of time since 2000. And so as you see some of our most low-lying communities shed population in some of our higher ground areas, places like Abita, Mandeville, Slidell, grow, it's largely in line with both disaster events and a perception of risk. This presents something of a problem for us in that, as we've seen populations retreat from these low-lying, vulnerable areas, we've also seen median incomes decline. So we're seeing a condition by which, people that have the financial flexibility to do so, in many cases, are self-selecting and moving to areas that they perceive to be safer, while those that don't have those same financial options unfortunately are left behind. Liz mentioned this idea of looking back to look forward. So the way that we're trying to talk about this is to say, let's start going back 50 years, and then we'll talk about what we think may come in the future. And so in 1960, you see the shape of Louisiana, this very well-defined boot. You see this shape on koozies, and you see it on T-shirts, and I think there's a Abita just came out with a beer called the Boot. The reality is that boot no longer exists. So now we have this very skeletal structure in our coastal areas. If we don't do anything, even that skeleton disappears in places like Houma and Jean Lafitte are now coastal cities, if you will. We're not going to do nothing. So we do have the Coastal Master Plan, and we can see the benefits of that plan in regenerating some of that land that would be lost. We also see some of the structural protections, things like Morganza to the Gulf. But the upshot is, even under this scenario by which we fully implement the Coastal Master Plan, we're going to lose land relative to what we have today. Right? And as we lose that land, there are communities that are within it. And so as we talk about that land loss condition, we can also largely track how we're going to see an increase in flood risk. So you see many of these very dark blues, those areas that are most susceptible to high-intensity flood events, largely in the East Bank of Tammany Parish, St. Bernard Parish. You see portions like East Niles here in St. Tammany. Again, if we do nothing, we see a whole lot more blue. So this is a fairly dire scenario. But we're not going to do nothing again, and we can see the benefits of the Coastal Master Plan, and we see some of the structural protections and how we see a little less of that very dark blue. But again, relative to today, we see this heightened sense of flood risk. So to help explain what we think this means here in St. Tammany Parish, I'm going to turn things over to Seth Magnan.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all again for coming out on a Wednesday night and joining us. So as Matt said, my name is Seth Magnan. I work with GCR and some of the good folks here in St. Tammany Parish. So we're going to go over some more specific, zoom in a little bit. You guys have looked at some of the regional maps, seen some regional data. We're going to zoom in a little bit. I know this is going to be very close to home for everyone here. So the first image we're going to look at, you can see, is an elevation map. And I realized that there are some different colors. You can see what some of you would expect, I guess, in the eastern part of the parish, which is on this side of the scale. I'm going to just spell it out for you. It shows some of the lighter areas as water, wetlands areas, and then the green is 3 to 6 foot or 0 to 3 foot above sea level, with the higher areas inland, of course, higher above sea level. So that's just, you probably have seen different variations of this map. This is just an elevation map to kind of help frame the conversation as we move forward into the first activity. So this is going to show you in 1960 where kind of the coast of St. Tammany Parish was. And moving forward to today, my clicker will go. So you can see, I'm going to just kind of toggle it back and forth. You guys can kind of see the change. So there's 1960 to today, so you can see some of those losses, right? Along the coast in the eastern part of the parish. Now we fast forward, again, going back to today, 1960, today, and no action. And now again, as you guys saw the previous set of slides at a regional level, this is again St. Tammany Parish. This is with some of the interventions in the coastal master plan. So you see the areas that are rebuilt in green there in certain parts of the parish. So we're going to look at these images now overlaid with some of the flood risks. Again, this is the flood risk today. The darker blue areas are higher risk. So you can see some dark blue pockets along the coast here. A lot, of course, in the eastern part of the parish. And this is, again, no action without the coastal master plan, without any interventions. A lot of dark blue shows. And the next slide, with the master plan, you're still seeing, however, quite a bit of dark blue, but you're seeing a lot less in certain parts here. And you can also see, still some pockets of higher risk. But again, this is with the coastal master plan. Now, I also want to draw your attention to, now we're looking at, the previous images showed you coastal risks. So we know very well, March and August of 2016, some of y'all in this room may have flooded last year, but this was inland flooding, right? This was riverine flooding. It wasn't associated with some of those coastal risks. So this is something that is very real and present for folks in St. Tammany. And these are just some kind of key data points. I won't go through each of them, but I will say, out of this number right here, the 1,124 households of March, 1,118 of those were not in special flood hazard areas. That means there were no flood zones. So what does that mean? That means that they were not projected to flood because they were not in special flood hazard areas, right? So those folks likely may not have carried flood insurance. And that's the same in this number here in August. It was 232 of those properties were not in special flood hazard areas. So that's something to keep in mind, some of those inland areas. And again, some of the folks in this room may have experienced this, have family that experienced this. So this is something to keep in mind as well. This is, again, a zoomed in image. You guys saw the greater regional where populations have shifted throughout the 6 parishes that we're looking at. So as Matt mentioned, post-Katrina, a lot of folks moved into St. Tammany. Some of them may be your neighbors, some of them may be here tonight. St. Tammany has a lot, if you think back to the elevation map, there's a lot of high ground. So you see a lot of population growth throughout the parish. We know from 1970 to today, the population of St. Tammany Parish has grown 293%. Pretty big number. So a lot of population growth in St. Tammany Parish, which is a good thing, and certainly comes with challenges as well. So you can see here, this is, I realize for some of the folks, it may be hard to see, but where the job centers are located. So some of the areas you might think, here around Slidell, some in Lacombe there, and then of course in Covington, Madisonville, Vanderbilt. Some of those names you probably recognize. A lot of work in healthcare, of course. A lot of jobs concentrated in some of those major hubs. So this next set of images, you guys may recognize. Anybody know what this intersection is here? This is the 190 and the 12, right? So this is 1998. And I'm going to move forward through these slides so you can start to see the development. And this is an example just of how quickly some of the areas in St. Tammany have grown. And so I'll back up just a little bit to 2009 and move forward over just the last years. I realize it's kind of hard to see in that. But you can see the development very, very quick in certain spots. So this is another thing we want you guys to think about as we move into this next activity. A lot of folks that live in St. Tammany drive somewhere else to work. A lot of the folks that work in St. Tammany come in from somewhere else, and then about a third live and work in St. Tammany. So there's a lot of inflow and outflow on a daily basis. So overall, some things that we want you to keep in mind, in addition to things I know you came to talk about. There's a lot of economic and population growth in St. Tammany over the past decade plus, of course. We know the St. Tammany Economic Development Foundation came out with their report, 20% increase in new business openings in 2016 over 2015, 14% increase in building permits. So there's a lot happening, right? A lot of good things happening. Folks are moving away from some of the more high-risk areas, moving further inland. I'm sure you've seen some of that. We know that the population, the average person you meet, as opposed to 1970, is a little older in St. Tammany Parish, so there's a little more of a mature population. And we also know, as I mentioned, there's increases in riverine flooding. So that's to think about in addition to the coastal risk. So these are just some things, to kind of think about the overall trends as we move into this first activity.
So with that, we'd like to turn it to you guys. We'd like you to turn your attention to your tables, and we'd like for you to think about and discuss as a table how these changes have affected you. How have you seen shifts in the environment? How have those environmental changes affected your community? We want you to consider maybe how your population has changed, or the circle of friends has grown a lot, or what have you actually seen in your community. We also want you to think about what types of economic shifts have you seen? Have you seen different types of investments? Where do you think that there are new changes that have affected you? And so we ask you to make friends with the people at your table and introduce yourself if you haven't already. Take a look at this activity, and your table host will go over those directions with you. But we hope that these can be fruitful discussions for you at your tables. And we'll turn some lights on so you guys can see it a little bit better. Okay, guys, it's about that time. We're going to go ahead and do the report out. Okay, guys, it's about time. We're going to go ahead and do the report out. We're sure that you've identified one person at your table who's going to tell the room the most important thing that you talked about. We want to be respectful of everybody's time here tonight. Okay, guys, we want to make sure we can let everybody out on time. We appreciate you being here. So do we have a table that would like to volunteer the first one main takeaway you want to hear tonight? Okay, Pop.
One of our,
Guys?
Hey guys, if we could, please.
attention, sir, back, Saints hat, sir, red hat, Saints hat, sir, blue shirt, back table.
Okay.
One of our members at our table is currently in I would call it crisis. He lives in a community along the Tammany Parish border between Mississippi and Slidell. It's on the other side of Eaton Isles. And he mentioned that the Corps of Engineers is clearing, I think, 300 acres of land and actually filling it with sediment, which in turn is pushing the marshland water that's in that area into his area. This has created flooding. It's caused children to be left out of school. They can't access roadways. They feel like they're being separated from the community and becoming an island onto their own. And so he wants to know what's being done about this in the immediate future, as opposed to 20, 30, 40 years out. What's being done now to help alleviate these fatigues that he has on his life? The Corps is putting land in there to try and restore wetlands and so on and so forth, but what are the mitigations that are being done to help out with his current situation and his community members? So.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Do we have another one? Who's our next table? Yeah? Go ahead, Seth. This table.
Okay, at our table we had some,
Hold it right here.
okay, Mark and Flo talked about how they are experiencing the same type of thing. They're experiencing the same type of problems that were just mentioned, where the land is being filled in and it's creating more problems for them down the road. Some other things that our group talked about was the fact that insurance premiums have gone up, and also that the increase in people in our area has led to a stress on our infrastructure, and it has caused us to have to change our way of talking to people and getting along with people in some cases, and so those are things that we seem to have had difficulty with at times.
Thank you. Because I'm going to stick up here because I'm 40.
Yeah, I'm gonna just move to this table, and we're gonna nominate someone just so we can kind of do it in order. So, who's the volunteer to report out at this table here? Ms. Barbara now.
Yeah, folks at the table here just said that primarily all the environmental changes, land loss, saltwater intrusion, increasing water levels, flooding, have caused all the other issues. Whether it's economic, population shifts, everything's interrelated, but they all said the environmental changes have caused those.
Thank you. Who's our next table?
Hi, I'm going to report out for this table. There's a lot of high emotion at this table. These people have experienced a lot of heartbreak over the past few years. And so we've heard about rising insurance costs with lower coverage. We've heard about higher taxes. But I think that one of the most moving was that they have less confidence now in the state's reaction and their ability to handle these things going forward. That's very serious to us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Candace. Who's volunteered this table? Great.
We have one over here.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Neil's next.
The principal problem that we seem to be having is with the drainage situation. They are not clearing the Bloom Bayou and its entrance into the Pearl River. That area's got a big sandbar in it that continually recurs, and it's not only keeping us from accessing the river, not only keeping the water from accessing the river, but it's lowering real estate values, because when you go to sell your house, you can't say that you have access down to the river because you can't get through that sandbar.
All right, you got one here.
It's funny we followed that gentleman right there, because we were talking about much of the same thing. Our big concern was more the West Pearl River itself. There's been a lot of effects according to the Wildlife and Fisheries. The West Pearl River is, the level of flow that's coming out into the Wrigley's is over 60% less now than we had 40 years ago. Okay? The river itself, just 25 years ago, when you had a well-defined channel that was 12 feet deep, dredged throughout it. Now that some of the barrier islands that are close by, such as Little Grassy, Half Moon, other waterways that are losing water from the west